Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Haunted Mario podcast. This is episode 9 and the first episode of the year 2016. We are happy to be back after a very long hiatus over the holidays, over the Thanksgiving holiday, New Year's, Christmas, and even through January and February. If you listened in to the last episode of the Haunted Mario podcast, which was our New Year special, we talked about the events of 2015, looked back on some of our favorite paranormal investigations, as well as the last 3 investigations that we conducted within the last 3 months of the year. So if you're interested in listening to some of the stuff that we caught there and some of our paranormal experiences, including guest appearance by my other half, my lovely wife Cassie, also known as Haunted Peach. She joined me on that podcast and we discussed our previous investigations. So that was a really wonderful special edition of the Haunted Mario podcast. So go ahead and listen to that if you haven't already. But moving forward, let's talk about this podcast. Now, kicking off this year, we're going to start off with a little themed podcast. We're going to get into something a little festive here. Now, we are currently in the month of March. St. Patrick's Day is quickly approaching, and to pay homage to the holiday of St. Patrick's Day, we figured it would be really cool to look into the 2 biggest legends in Irish folklore, and those are leprechauns and banshees. Yep, that's right. The mischievous leprechaun and the wailing banshee. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that in a few moments, but first off, if you've been keeping up with the Haunted Mario Facebook page, we have been trying to keep up with that page and posting updates here and there. If you have kept up with it, you know that Haunted Peach and I both attended the Halloween Club Halloween Spook Show, which was held this past weekend in La Mirada, the Halloween Club in La Mirada here in Southern California. That was a fantastic event. We love going every year. We are Halloween fanatics, so it's a great way to sort of refresh ourselves with some Halloween spirit in the beginning of the year, being that we miss Halloween so much throughout the rest of the year. Now, with that being said, the event itself was free. It had free admission. I was posting about the event for the last couple of weeks on the Haunted Mario page. We were very excited to be able to go there. They had live music, tons of vendors, artwork, Halloween props, Halloween sales going on, food trucks, cosplay, you name it, this place had it, and it was really great. Some of the highlights for me in particular were seeing a couple of the live bands. It seemed to be sort of a Halloween themed punk rock bands going on. That was pretty cool. One of the bands had this robot dancing while they were performing. That was really fun. The vendors were great. We bought a lot of artwork, so there were vendors showing off their products and different like Halloween masks and haunted tours and whatnot. So it was a great spectacle. I did get to meet up with a paranormal researcher and investigator by the name of Victor Huesca. He has written a book for Haunted East Los Angeles, where he talks about some of the haunts in the Los Angeles area. So if you have a chance, pick up that book. It's Haunted East Los Angeles. The author's name again is Victor Huesca. It's a great book. I bought it. He signed it for me. We talked briefly, and maybe, just maybe, we might have a secret paranormal investigation coming up in the future that we are pretty excited about. So hopefully this pans out and he and I can work together, and maybe I can have him on the podcast, interview him very briefly on some of his past paranormal experiences as well. But other than that, it was great to see him, great to talk to him about a couple of things, And aside from that, we also ran into a very dear friend of ours and someone who has provided two of probably the best pieces of paranormal equipment that we use. His name is Mike Murray, and he is from Paranormal Tech. He creates a lot of different type of paranormal equipment, all of them custom made. He has different tech from lighting to EMF to K2 meters to special combinations of both or all three. You name it, this guy has it. So if you're interested in some of his paranormal tech, I highly recommend getting it from him. He's an incredible guy, and hopefully we'll meet up with him in the future with a future investigation. We are looking to possibly being able to attend the Virginia City Paracon for this year. He is going to be there as well, and if you all want to join us or join in on a really awesome historic place to investigate, Virginia City is definitely the place. But anyway, if you're interested in his tech, his paranormal tech, you can go to paranormal-tech.com. That's paranormal-tec.com. A lot of it is reasonably priced, and he stands by his products, and his products are great, and I stand by them as well. So thanks, Mike Murray, for all the stuff that you've provided us, and we're happy to use your equipment. It works fantastic. And so moving on from that, let's talk a little bit more about the Halloween Spook Show. Now, it is so wonderful to see so many people that are so enthusiastic about Halloween. I would say that at least a good 25 to 30% of the people that were there were dressed up in cosplay. Probably the best cosplay that we saw out of anyone at the Spook Show was this large group of cosplayers all dressed up as different characters of The Walking Dead. Now, if you know anything about Haunted Mario and Haunted Peach, you know that The Walking Dead is our favorite show. There is not a Sunday where we have missed The Walking Dead. We've been with it from the start. We love every episode, and we're always eager and excited to see the newest episode. So seeing some Walking Dead cosplay was really awesome. And that kind of covers it for the Spook Show highlights in general. If you've been following Haunted Mario on Facebook, you will also know that now we are on Instagram and Twitter. So feel free to go follow us on Instagram and Twitter. If you want to follow us on Instagram, you can go to instagram.com/Haunted Mario. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, then you can look for me at the Twitter handle at The Haunted Mario. And the is capitalized. So at THE, all capitals, Haunted Mario. And you can find me on Twitter and follow me there for some of the pictures and posts that I post on Instagram and Twitter. This is fairly new. We already have quite a few followers, and I'm very happy for the support that we're getting on that. I do definitely appreciate that. We're going to try to expand Haunted Mario, and maybe in the future, if we can, we're going to start doing some raffles and do some contests, and then maybe give out some prizes that we can send out to the Haunted Mario listeners. Anyway, moving forward, there's just a few updates of what we've recently done and what might be on the horizon moving forward. So getting into the topics of the actual podcast. We're going to start off with probably the most well-known Irish traditional legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, but it is the leprechaun. Now, when you think of a leprechaun, you think of the older short man with a beard, and he's got a green top hat, and he wears a green suit, and the top hat has a 4-leaf clover, and he goes around trying to trick people, and if you catch the the leprechaun at the end of the rainbow, you'll find this pot of gold and all of that, stereotypical stuff. But where does the legend of the leprechaun actually come from? Now, a bigger question is, how is a leprechaun in general related to the paranormal? Well, when you look at the history of the leprechaun, or even the leprechaun itself, what type of being it is, most people, or at least in the Irish folklore and legends, are that the leprechaun is actually a fairy. Not a female fairy, but a male fairy. Essentially, the fairy itself has magical properties that allow it to grant people wishes. Now, when you think of fairies, you don't necessarily think of leprechauns, but fairies are a paranormal anomaly that exists all throughout the world, mainly in European countries, such as Ireland. The notion of fairies has actually been around for centuries. And from the concept of fairies came the widely known version of the leprechaun. If you look at the origin of the leprechaun itself, now, the earliest known reference to leprechauns appears in a medieval story. It is known as the adventure of Fergus, son of Lety. Now, the story claims that Fergus mac Lety, which is the king of Ulster, falls asleep on a beach and then wakes up to himself being dragged into the sea by 3 leprechauns. He ends up capturing the leprechauns, and they then grant him 3 wishes in exchange for his release. So leprechauns essentially started as folklore from a tale from the medieval times. Originally, the leprechaun actually had a different appearance. Prior to the 20th century, it was depicted as a leprechaun wearing red and not green. In 1831, an author by the name of Samuel Lover wrote describing a leprechaun as, in quotes, "quite a beau in his dress, notwithstanding, for he wears a red square-cut coat, richly laced with gold, and inexpressible of the same cocked hat, shoes, and buckles." That's just a very different description. Red as opposed to green, like we've all known to associate to the actual leprechaun. You have depictions such as the northern leprechaun, which actually wore a military red coat and white breeches with a broad-brimmed, high-pointed hat, and he would sometimes stand upside down. And I'm just reading a description here of what the different types of leprechaun depictions that have been over the years. Now, the image of the leprechaun itself has become widely known as the green-dressed, short man with the red beard and smoking a pipe. A lot of different films have depicted him, most notably the Leprechaun horror series. You have football teams such as like the Notre Dame Fighting Irish that have the leprechaun, of course, as their big mascot. Of course, Lucky Charms has the leprechaun. It's weird, but in general, the leprechaun itself has become a staple and an iconic figure in Irish folklore and Irish culture. Now, we've already touched on a very small portion of the history and origin of the leprechaun, but there is just a little bit additional information. Some of it is kind of the same, but just want to read this one passage that gives just a little more information on some of the origins of leprechaun myths in general. Some claims state that the leprechaun actually predates the Celtic occupation and was connected to the belief in the Tuatha De Danann, peoples of the goddess of Danu, and other quasi-historical races that are said to be the original inhabitants of the island. At some point in Ireland's history, the leprechaun became a distinguishable entity from the other mythical creatures, recognized as taking the form of a small old man who was sly and lived in solitude, although they were also sometimes believed to be mischievous. By trade, they were cobblers or shoemakers for other types of fairies, but were never seen making more than one shoe. Early on, they were connected to hidden wealth, having many buried treasure crocks that they guarded with their cunning and wit. However, leprechauns seemed to be vulnerable to direct attention by humans, and if anyone kept a fixated eye on a leprechaun and interrogated him thoroughly enough, the leprechaun could not escape and would eventually be forced to divulge the location of the gold. However, if the human looked away, even for just a split second, the leprechaun would escape. So just a little bit of additional little tidbits of information about the leprechaun, some of its history, and some of the folklore surrounding it. Now let's move on to the real reason why we're discussing leprechauns. We want to just touch bases on a few of actual claims of leprechaun sightings. Now, these have not been proven to be fact, but these are just very interesting sightings and claims of people that have reported seeing actual leprechauns either in Ireland or even in other areas outside of Ireland all throughout the world. Now, the first brief story I want to share with you about a leprechaun sighting actually happened in 1992. This story is brought to you courtesy of the website irishcentral.com. It reads, in 1992, a 15-year-old boy spied two figures just over 3 feet tall sea fishing on the Aran Islands in Galway. The figures were each reportedly dressed in green and wearing brown shoes, and were speaking to each other in Irish before they disappeared. One of these small figures left behind a pipe, which the 15-year-old witness took possession of, although it curiously disappeared later despite being safely locked away. It's an interesting story. This kid appears to have seen 2 leprechauns, or what he believed to be leprechauns. Now the next story is kind of a lengthy one. This one is titled Leprechaun Torments Family in New Jersey. Pretty odd place to witness a leprechaun, but here are some of the accounts from that actual story. Okay, so these are basically just excerpts from an interview that a journalist had with a family that was supposedly being terrorized by a leprechaun. It says, in the living room, the child was playing with his toys. Hey Joey, the child didn't move. Hey Joey, your mom told me you have seen a little man around the house. Yes, replied Joey. What does he look like? He is like this tall, the little boy explained, lifting his hand about 5 inches off the floor. Black dress, and he screams at me. He teaches me new words. What do you mean? Like English words? What kind of words? I don't know, different words, a different language, he said. Creepy, that intrigued me. It would explain the earlier odd gibberish sounds that reminded me of Welsh. The words meant happy, killer, monster. Alas, I didn't know at the time. Do you know where he lives? I asked him. In a tree in the backyard, Joey said, pointing at the window. It would get dark soon. I went back to the kitchen and asked the mother to give me a tour around. It was a big backyard with a swing and a sandbox. There were red maples, pitch pines, and right in the corner bordering the fence there was a huge black cherry tree. That's his house, the child screamed. I approached the tree and I noticed there were tiny tracks on the snow. They were the size of a thumbnail. Whatever walked over that patch only used 2 legs. I wondered if the mother had been purposely doing this before I arrived. I smelled a hoax. A few seconds later I realized that the mother couldn't have possibly done that. The only human tracks to the tree were mine, and the smaller tracks were recent. So he lives here? I asked. That's what Joey says. I have never seen anything on that tree, maybe a squirrel or two every now and then, said Miss Macaulay. He lives inside, the child was getting frustrated. Is there a hole or anything? I inquired as I studied the tree thoroughly. He gets in from the bottom, he digs a bit, then cling clang, he uses the staircase all the way up, said Joey with a creepy lilt in his voice, pointing at the sky with his little index finger. And then it goes on. After dinner, Joey and I went to the living room and talked while his mom worked on some chores in the kitchen. There were crayons and a permanent marker over the coffee table. I asked the kid to paint the leprechaun for me. Children's pictures are strange, grotesque, like a caricature, but Joey's painting was dark, it inspired fear. Not what you'd expect from a 5-year-old. Of all the colors, he chose black. And then it kind of goes on from there, adding some more information. He does go on to say, I was on my way out of the house when I couldn't find my car keys. I was sure I had put them on top of the kitchen table. The little man took them, said Joey. Where did he go? Asked his mother. To his house, answered the child. I went to the backyard thinking I might have dropped the keys on the snow earlier while I was inspecting the big tree. I couldn't find them there either. Out of frustration, I looked up the tree. Surprisingly, the keys were there, hanging on a branch 50 feet up. There was no way little Joey could have been able to reach up there. Also, there were no tracks other than mine from my previous inspection. There were, however, more little tracks on the snow around the tree. This time, Miss Macaulay caught me and gave me a short lecture. I said goodbye to Joey and I thanked his mom for the hospitality. So that's a pretty interesting account of a leprechaun in New Jersey. Now, if you want to read the entire story, you can go to cryptozoology-news.com/leprechaun-new-jersey/. And that is the actual story, the full story. It includes the picture of the alleged leprechaun tracks, as well as the little drawing that Joey did for the journalist. So if you want to read up on that, you can definitely do that. So I do have one last story. It's a very short, very brief story that mentions the sighting of a leprechaun. The location of this is Newmarket on Fergus, which I believe is in Ireland. Labeled a fairy sighting around the early 1900s. The comments read, residents who live close to the lough reported hearing the wail of a banshee which lasted for several nights. When the cries ceased and no one died, the locals doubted whether the sounds actually came from a banshee. A little man in green was also spotted in the area, matching the description of a leprechaun. A witness tried to grab him for his gold, but the little man vanished. So that's a very small, very brief claim of a sighting of a leprechaun, but it does segue into the next legendary Irish mythical being or entity known as the Banshee. Now herein lies an interesting dichotomy, where you have the leprechaun, which is a playful trickster that likes to play pranks, but is sort of a joyful figure. And then you have, on the opposite side, the Banshee. Now the Banshee itself is generally perceived as a negative entity, not an entity that per se attacks humans, but a being that brings about death. So in essence, a Banshee is a female spirit in Irish mythology. It's usually seen as an omen of death and a messenger from the underworld. In legend, the Banshee was a fairy woman who begins to wail if someone is about to die. Now, there are Irish families who are believed to have banshees attached to them and whose cries herald the death of a member of that family. Now, the Banshee is often described in Gaelic lore as wearing red or green, usually with long, disheveled hair. She can appear in a variety of forms, perhaps most often is seen as an ugly, frightful hag, but can also appear as a young and beautiful woman if she chooses. Most, though not all, surnames associated with banshees have the O or muck or mac prefix, indicating a family native to the insular Celtic lands rather than those of the Norse, English, or Norman invaders. Accounts of banshees actually reach as far back as 1380. Now, in Ireland and parts of Scotland, a traditional part of mourning is the Keenig woman, who wails a lament. This Keenig woman may in some cases be a professional, and the best keeners would be in high demand. Legend has it that for great Gaelic families, the O'Grady's, the O'Neills, the O'Longs, the McNamans, the O'Briens, the O'Concabears, and the Calmanacs, the lament would be sung by a fairy woman having foresight. She would sing it when a family member died, even if the person had died far away and news of their death had not yet come, so that the wailing of the banshee was the first warning the household had of the death. In later versions, the banshee might appear before the death and warn the family by wailing. When several banshees appear at once, it indicates the death of someone great or holy. The tale sometimes recounted that the woman, though called a fairy, was a ghost, often of a specific murdered woman or a mother who died in childbirth. So that basically covers just a brief history or look into the origins of the banshee, sometimes referred to as the harbinger of death. Now, I do have a few stories regarding Banshee sightings that I'd like to share. The first one actually comes from reddit.com. It's just simply titled Banshee Sighting. It reads, "This is a story my dad told me of his first-hand experience. Short and sweet, so it is. My dad was 18 or 19 at the time with two other mates. They drove to some pub in a rural town. One mate was called Bert. He had said, 'I don't feel too good tonight, Al. I'll just stay in my car for a bit.' So my dad and his other mate went into the pub. This was around 9 p.m. After getting lashed and forgetting about him being left in the car, he went out around 11 p.m. to check on him. He looked in and Bert was in the middle back seat when previously in the front seat, bolt up straight, tears streaming in a trance-like state with a pale face. My dad tried to open the door, but it was locked. He tried to snap him out of the trance, saying firmly, 'Bert, unlock the door, Bert.' He opened the doors and immediately said, 'Did you hear that?' 'Hear what?' said my dad. Bert quickly replied, 'Take me home,' not breaking a stare out the windshield. So they drove home, Bert not saying a word, my dad asking what happened, but he wouldn't reply and didn't want to stress him. So he just dropped him home and Bert just left without saying a word. The next day, the other friend asked Bert why he was freaked last night. He said that this black figure of a woman stood in front of the car, came flying up to the windshield face to face with him, giving a deathly scream with an open mouth so large it was unhuman, with an empty blackness and terrifying eyes, just staring at him, then flew off. He moved to the middle seat to feel less exposed. Bert eventually found out that his uncle was pronounced dead around 11 p.m. that night also." That's a pretty interesting story of a banshee, but something that fits to the description of what a banshee is an omen for, which is death. So let's move on to the next one here. This one is titled Hampshire Banshee in Ireland, and it comes from fairyist.com. It says, "It was during our first visit to Ireland in September 1948 that my wife Eve and I went with our hostess to spend a day or two at her brother's house in Killigally, south of Athlone. It was a big Georgian house, almost a mansion, built on the ruins of an ancient nunnery, but being Ireland and remoter Ireland at that, it had no modern conveniences such as gas or electricity. Thus it happened that in the evening we were gathered round a log fire in a huge and lofty 18th century room, dimly illuminated by 2 candles set in tall silver candlesticks, engaged in conversation such as one can enjoy only in Ireland. It was a still night, but pouring with rain. The great window shutters were closed. There was no other house within a mile, and it was half a mile to the lodge gates on the highway. We were listening to reminiscences of the past when I heard a most unearthly howling noise from somewhere outside. I looked at my wife and she looked at me, but the others continued talking as though they had not heard it. Again there came that uncanny wailing, more prolonged this time, and still they made no remark, although it was manifest that they were rather disconcerted. Our query, "What was that?" passed unheeded, when for a third time there was that eerie howling, rising and falling in pitch, and even more persistent and insistent than before. It was impossible to ignore it, but our host's only reaction was to rise abruptly and say, "I think we're stirring them up too much. We had all better go to bed." Without more ado, he bade us good night and left the room. There was nothing more to be said, so each of us lighted our candles and went to our rooms. Once we were in our bedroom, by force of habit I looked at my watch, which showed a little after 10 o'clock. My wife Eve said to me, "Whatever was that weird howling? One would think it was a banshee." I replied, "Well, it was certainly not a dog or a fox or an owl. It was quite unlikely of these, and the persistent, mournful rising and falling wail sent cold shivers down the spine. I believe it was a banshee, and if so, it is a bad omen for someone here tonight." It was with subdued and apprehensive feelings that we eventually settled down for the night. The next day our friends absolutely ignored any attempt to refer to the matter, and in the course of a really delightful holiday we soon forgot our fears and forebodings, and the whole affair sank into the background of our minds. The sequel came when our holiday was over and we returned to our little college at Waterlooville in Hampshire, where we were all living at the time. There we learnt, to our distress, that a very dear friend and neighbor had been terribly injured by 2 burglars and was critically ill in hospital. He was the owner of a laundry situated at the rear of our cottage, and he lived in a house at the end of the road, so he had to pass our cottage on his journeys between his home and the laundry. On the very night on which we heard the banshee, our friend had occasion to visit the laundry office, which was situated upstairs on the first floor. He entered the building using an electric torch to see his way, and as he went to mount the stairs to the office, he was attacked by the 2 men concealed there, who struck him down and then hurled a large cash box at his head, which gave him a dreadful injury. He lost consciousness but regained it again some time, and then attempted to reach his home. It must have been a nightmare journey as he crawled along, weak with loss of blood and with spells of unconsciousness. At last he reached the door of our cottage, and he has a distinct recollection of sitting on the doorstep, fervently wishing that we were at home and could not come to his aid. Eventually he did manage to reach his home just as his son was about to go in search of him. For a long time his life was despaired of, but brilliant surgery and careful nursing restored him to health once more. Checking over the details with him, when he was well enough to discuss him, we discovered that he was sitting on our doorstep, mentally calling us in his distress, at the very same time that we were listening to that wailing banshee in Ireland. Wow, that is an incredibly intense story about a banshee encounter. Now, a lot of the encounters that are referred to, or these sightings or claims, generally discuss hearing a banshee. Rarely do they ever have an actual sighting of a banshee. It seems like the banshee is probably one of the rarest paranormal entities that you could come across. The first story obviously had the witness coming face to face with an actual banshee. The second story actually dealt with hearing the wails of a banshee. So that's very interesting. That's something that I came across when trying to research some of these stories, is that actual sightings of a banshee are actually less commonplace than hearing the wail of a banshee. So that I found that quite interesting. Alright, so moving on to the third one. This one is actually taken from a book called True Irish Ghost Stories by St. John D. Seymour and Harry L. Nelligan, written in 1914. You can find this one at sacred-texts.com. That's sacred-texts.com. And a little excerpt from this book goes on to read, one of the oldest and best known Banshee stories is that related in the Memoirs of Lay Fanshawe. In 1642, her husband, Sir Richard, and she chanced to visit a friend, the head of an Irish sept, who resided in his ancient baronial castle surrounded with a moat. At midnight, she was awakened by a ghastly and supernatural scream, and looking out of bed beheld in the moonlight a female face and part of the form hovering at the window. The distance from the ground, as well as the circumstance of the moat, excluded the possibility that what she beheld was of this world. The face was that of a young and rather handsome woman, but pale, and the hair, which was reddish, was loose and disheveled. The dress, which Lady Fanshawe's terror did not prevent her remarking accurately, was that of the ancient Irish. This apparition continued to exhibit itself for some time, and then vanished with two shrieks similar to that which had first excited Lady Fanshawe's attention. In the morning, with infinite terror, she communicated to her host what she had witnessed, and found him prepared not only to credit, but to account for the superstition. A near relation of my family, said he, expired last night in this castle. We disguised our certain expectation of the event from you, lest it should throw a cloud over the cheerful reception which was your due. Now, before such an event happens in this family or castle, the female spectre whom you have seen is always visible. She is believed to be the spirit of a woman of inferior rank, whom one of my ancestors degraded himself by marrying, and whom afterwards, to expiate the dishonor done to his family, he caused to be drowned in the moat. In strictness, this woman could hardly be termed a banshee. The motive for the haunting is akin to that in the tale of the Scotch drummer of Cortachy, where the spirit of the murdered man haunts the family out of revenge and appears before a death. Wow, that's a pretty interesting story. A very old story from 1642, but a full sighting of an actual banshee. And again, relating to an omen of death, in which a death actually did occur. To me, I've always found that banshees are probably one of the most interesting personifications of what would be considered sort of an angel of death. So there's a great fascination from that. That basically does it for the leprechaun and banshee folklore and origins. I just wanted to touch upon those briefly because I deeply love the Irish culture, and I'm very hopeful that sometime in the near future we could travel to Ireland and be able to investigate some of the haunted locations out there. Some very, very ancient haunted locations that are located in Ireland, like the castles or even some of the caves or caverns. It would be a great experience. I do want to thank you all for listening in to this latest episode of the Haunted Mario Podcast, and again, the very first episode of the year 2016. I'm looking forward to doing many more podcasts for this year. Some of them might be themed just the way this one was, and where I might be talking about some of the myths and legends pertaining to that particular month or holiday. Moving forward for this month, be on the lookout for a brand new creature feature. We're going to keep up with the theme of St. Patrick's Day and everything in Irish mythology. The creature feature, which will be updated within the next week or so, will actually be about Irish dragons. the legendary myths of Irish dragons and where they originate from, but also dragons in general. So we'll take a look at that mythology and also be on the lookout for an update to Supernatural Spotlight. I will be casting the spotlight on a very special location in Ireland that is probably the most haunted location in Ireland, so be on the lookout for that. And I will also be adding some Irish folklore writings into the Ghostwriter section of the website, so be on the lookout for that as well. I will definitely keep the posts updated when those are available and up on the site. And again, if you want to follow us, be sure to follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, you can go to the hauntedmario.com website, and right on the sidebar you'll see a quick link to the Twitter page. You can just click like there. If you want to follow us on Instagram, just go to instagram.com/hauntedmario, and you'll see some of the pictures that we posted. Some of the pictures from the Spook Show are also available there. If you haven't done so yet, please like the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/hauntedmariohq. Go ahead and give it a like for the most recent updates and what we're up to. I also post a lot of stuff about the paranormal on that Facebook page, as well as any updates to any events that we might be attending. And lastly, if you haven't done so yet, feel free to go to our YouTube channel and subscribe to that. All of the podcast episodes are updated and posted to the YouTube channel. Along with that, you'll be able to find a ton of videos with just about all of the really great evidence that we've captured on our past investigations. So feel free to go and subscribe and check out the videos. All of your support is greatly appreciated, and we look forward to continuing with new paranormal investigations and new podcasts, new features on the website. So stay tuned for all of that. Again, I do want to thank you all for the support and for allowing me to bring you a little insight into all things paranormal. And just as always, happy hauntings.